Harriet Loveday, The Adventure of the Christmas Cracker, and Other Short Stories. Story 5. My Christmas Angel. Little Rowan played with his train set as his proud mother looked on. "I love you, my darling," she said. "Yes," he said, looking up at her, nodding and smiling. Never had Maddie believed she could love a little person so much. She would do anything for this little tiny human. She hugged him and bathed him. She chatted with him. They were so happy in their little unit of two. Their love was pure and their connection unbreakable. There was only one thing that troubled Maddie, her ex-boyfriend and Rowan's father, Darren. He was controlling and he was trouble. He had abandoned her pregnant. Maddie had been scared to do it alone, but with the help of her family, she had successfully navigated being a single parent. For the sake of little Rowan, she had encouraged a relationship with his father. Darren had reappeared a few days after she had given birth. But she was worried because every time Darren visited Rowan, Darren would become more aggressive and controlling towards her. Maddie had reported it to the police, that she had found Darren in her bedroom going through her personal belongings, that she had come home to find the gas cooker on 2 occasions, that she had caught him at the front door with a stolen set of house keys, and that she had to pay to change the locks again, with money she didn't have. Maddie was frightened, yet in her heart she loved Rowan so much she didn't want to separate him from his father. Secretly, she hoped that Darren would eventually come to love Rowan as much as she did. Even though Darren didn't offer financial support, he did regularly visit Rowan, and she was glad for Rowan's sake. Darren seemed so attentive towards Rowan. He tried to play with Rowan's little trains and sing him lullabies. The only horrible part of it was, as soon as her back was turned, he was upstairs rifling through her things again, and little Rowan was all alone. Maddie was feeling more and more uneasy about the whole situation. It was just 5 days to Christmas. Maddie hoped that Darren had bought Rowan some presents this year, although she understood that Rowan was still young enough not to notice. The doorbell rang. It was starting to get dark. She had an unsettled feeling in her stomach. Maddie looked out of the window. It was Darren. He was swaying slightly as if he was drunk. He motioned at her through the window to come to the door. Maddie looked at Rowan, happily playing with his trains on the rug. It was nearly bath time. She wished Darren would go away, but surely it would be okay. He wouldn't hurt them. Maddie opened the door to a cloud of alcohol and fumes. Darren aggressively pushed the door fully open. Maddie jumped back in surprise. Darren spat at her more than spoke to her as he said, "Who is he? Who have you been with? They told me at the pub. I know all about it. Don't think you'll get any money off me now," he was shouting. Maddie felt embarrassed that the neighbours would hear. He continued, "I'm going to take Rowan away, and there's nothing you can do about it." He motioned to little Rowan, who stood motionless in the doorway to the living room. He was clutching a little train and looking scared. "Ummy," Rowan called with his arms outstretched. He started to cry. "Who taught him to make that whining noise?" Darren spat at her. "He's too soft. He needs to learn what life's really like." Maddie was scared. She thought quickly and said, "Oh, look!" She pointed behind Darren. "The police!" Darren spun around, wobbling, and nearly tumbled over as Maddie neatly slammed the door behind him. They were safe for now, but it wasn't the end of it. He hammered and raged and stormed. Rowan ran to her crying. Like a little limpet, he wrapped his tiny arms around her neck. He wasn't budging. Shakily, Maddie picked up the phone to call the police. This time at least, he had done something she could report. Maddie hadn't been the only one to report him. The neighbours had too. The police interviewed her, and they discussed the situation with her. The difficulty was that as Darren had equal responsibility for Rowan as she did, the police did not have the power to stop Darren seeing Rowan. Maddie was not going to allow Rowan to have unsupervised visits with Darren. Secretly, she was worried for Rowan's safety, and so the current visiting arrangement looked set to continue. The female officer offered advice. So she suggested mediation and gave Maddie a booklet with details of a child contact centre. There was no way that Maddie could afford it. Maddie thanked the officer, sucked in a brave breath and said that she was sure it was just a drunken incident and that she knew Darren loved Rowan. She thought it was just a blip and it would all be okay when he was sober. The police officers exchanged looks and left shortly after. That night, when it was quiet and dark, when Rowan was safely sleeping in his cot bed, Maddie allowed her emotions to surface. She had been holding it all in. She had been so brave, but she was scared. First her body started to shake uncontrollably. Then she curled into a ball, twisting into the duvet. Then came the tears and the sobs. She buried her head in the pillow so that she wouldn't wake Rowan. From the far side of the bedroom, in the darkness, a sad set of eyes looked on. Their eyes welled up with tears, and tears dripped out of their nose. Trying to hold it together, they held themselves tall so that they wouldn't start sobbing. The partially open bedroom door pushed back a little as two more sets of sad eyes joined them. One thought to the other, "How is she?" The first entity answered, "She suffers so much. She is a good mother. I wish I could ease her pain." The third entity thought, "It is so hard to watch these lessons, but we cannot interfere. She has free choice. She must find a path through this." The first entity replied, "Yes, that is true, my friend, but I am here to walk that path with her." All three turned to watch the silently shaking, sobbing mass. Frightened, scared, and apparently alone in this world, protecting her baby. 3 pairs of eyes welled with sympathy. The first entity broke away from the others and silently approached the bed. Opening their arms, they engulfed the frightened woman in a warm embrace. Maddie's fears started to subside. She was reminded of her gran, who had passed nearly 5 years ago. She could smell her gran's subtle perfume, and she could feel her warm embrace. She remembered that she was loved, even though she felt so scared and alone right now. Her soul slowly found peace in that memory, and the tears started to subside. The first entity turned to their friends, with tears streaming down their face, and their eyes met 2 similarly tear-stained sets of eyes. The second entity thought, "I'm going back to watch the child," and quietly left. The third entity moved to stand quietly at the base of the bed. Like a sentry guard, they watched Maddie sleep until morning. Maddie's friend listened patiently before she replied, "I have to be honest, Maddie. I think you're making a mountain out of a molehill." Maddie sat motionless and cold as her friend delivered her verdict. "Everyone at the pub knows how much Darren talks of Rowan. He has photos of him on his phone that he shows everyone. He even put 20 quid in the children's charity box at the bar because he said he wants to help kids. He's a very generous guy. I have to be honest, I think the problem is you." She laid a reassuring hand on her friend's arm. "Don't get me wrong, I don't think you know you are doing it, but subconsciously you are alienating Rowan from Darren just because he left you pregnant. He didn't have to stay. People break up all the time. Darren is doing his bit and is a doting father. I really don't think you can ask for more. I think you're being selfish, quite frankly." Maddie sat cold. She couldn't speak. She just stared down at her untouched coffee. Her friend continued her judgment. "Look, it's Christmas. Just give Darren some time alone with Rowan without you breathing over his shoulder. I've seen him around other children. He's kind and a thoughtful man. Just think about it, okay? It's Christmas." Maddie's heart turned in on itself. The thought of Darren being left alone with Rowan chilled her. From behind Maddie, a hand gently reached out and rested on her shoulder, but neither Maddie or her friend saw the gesture. It was Christmas Eve. Maddie had a wonderful day visiting family with Rowan. When they got home, she put out a stocking, milk, and cookies for Santa. Now, not that Rowan really understood what was going on, more that she wanted to start the tradition. Maddie stood over Rowan's cot bed, watching him sleeping peacefully. Behind her, 2 entities watched quietly too. Maddie was a good mother. A third entity joined them and smiled at the loving scene before them. The doorbell rang. Maddie's heart sank. Part of her didn't want to go, but it was only delaying the inevitable, and if she didn't go, he'd only make a fuss and wake up Rowan. Perhaps it was best to face this head on and get things out in the open. Maddie stooped over the cot bed and gently stroked her sleeping son's cheek. Kissing her fingertip, she paced the kiss on the tip of his nose. Sighing deeply, she left the room. The first entity turned to the third and thought, "Go now. You must be quick. Make sure they make the call. Be quick." The third entity disappeared. Maddie descended the stairs with a slow, heavy step. She had to be brave. Who else would protect Rowan's interests? She looked at the hall clock. It was 10 to 8. Opening the door ajar, she saw Darren. Apologetically, he said, "It's Christmas, and I just wanted to sort things out for the good of Rowan." With a deep sigh, she took the chain off the door and let him in. Maddie closed the door behind Darren and turned to show him through to the living room, only to find his hand around her throat. "Idiot," he said. "Do you think I don't know what you've been saying about me, trying to ruin my reputation? I gave you chances. I tried my best, but you just want to control me. Well, it's time I took Rowan. My turn," he smiled. Maddie gasped under his grasp. Her only thought was Rowan. She had to get her baby out alive. He pressed her back against the wall and brought his face to hers. "You going to try your tricks again?" "No, pleased to save you this time." His eyes were black, blank and motionless, like a deep bottomless well. Maddie acted on the last thought her brain was able to provide oxygen for. She brought her knee firmly upward with as much force as she could muster. Darren collapsed, gasping, to the ground. Maddie scrabbled her way up the stairs as fast as she could. She had to get to Rowan. Just seconds behind her was Darren. Maddie burst into Rowan's room. She scooped him into her arms and back towards the window. Darren came in and stood in the doorway, blocking their exit. His large frame was silhouetted in black against the hall light behind him. Rowan was screaming in his mother's arms. She held him tight to her. All she could think was, "Someone, please help me. He is going to kill us. Please help. Save little Rowan." Darren reached into his pocket and pulled out a gun. Aiming it at Rowan's head, he said, "I think it's about time you experienced the pain you have caused me, ruining my reputation, trying to do things your way. I'm in control. Me." Maddie turned away from Darren, putting herself between the gun and Rowan, cowering in her body over her screaming son. The gun fired. Rowan continued to scream. Maddie held him tight. What had happened? She turned around to see Darren holding the gun and looking puzzled. To his left was a large hole in Rowan's bedroom wall. He looked directly at her, took aim at her head, and fired again. In the half-light, the entity raised their hand. This time the bullet ricocheted to the right. From downstairs, Maddie could hear her front door being smashed in. She cowered by the window, her body over her son. She was speechless. Darren looked at the gun, looked over his shoulder, and rushed into Maddie's bedroom. She could hear him trying to open her bedroom window. Specialist police ran up the stairs. 2 ran to her bedroom. 1 came directly to her. Despite the insanity of the moment, Maddie suddenly felt calm as she held her screaming son. 2 sets of loving arms embraced them both. It was the early hours of Christmas morning before Maddie finally fell asleep, on the blow-up mattress on the living room floor of her parents' house. Maddie awoke before everyone else, curled like a cat around the small body of her sleeping son. The events of the night before flooded back to her. Her face was wet with tears, and she was trying her best not to shake and wake Rowan. Her mind raced as she relived the memories. She whispered to herself, "We're safe now, we're safe, we're safe." Maddie couldn't believe that they were still alive. They were so lucky. Thank goodness her neighbours had called the police. Despite the mix-up about the times, the police insisted that they had received the call at 10 to 8, saying that a gun had been fired. Maddie insisted again and again that Darren had arrived at 10 to 8. She was sure. What did it matter, though? Thank God the police had come when they did. Little Rowan stirred beside her. His first words were, wake up, Ummy." "I'm awake, my darling," she replied. Maddie kissed his little forehead. "Look, Ummy, look." Rowan pointed to the sofa opposite them. Maddie peered in the half-light. The morning sun was filtering its way through the curtains, but all she saw was an empty sofa. "What is it, my darling?" she asked. "Look, Ipu last night." Rowan pointed again. Maddie's eyes knitted together with a puzzled expression. "People from last night? Darling, there's no one there." "Look, Ummy, look." Rowan smiled happily at the empty sofa. Maddie wasn't religious, but when her parents offered if she and Rowan wanted to come to church with them for the Christmas morning service, Maddie was positive they did. Holding her little person's hand, she walked to church with her parents. She repeated the same phrase to herself. "Thank you for my gift of life with this little person. I love him most in the world. I will not forget this act of love. I will not forget it." Beside each of them walked an entity. The second entity thought to the first, "We're not supposed to interfere, really, you know." The first entity thought back, "I know, but it isn't only humans that have free will. We do too." "That is true, my friend, we do," replied the second entity. The first entity smiled at the loving mother and child as they replied, "I think they have a lovely story to tell, don't you?" "Yes, my friend, I do." And reaching down, the entity affectionately ruffled the small child's hair just as the morning breeze bustled past.